where's Mr. Tharoor? Sorry, Dr. Tharoor. Just like Dr. Malia, I got confused sometimes when I meet them. Ladies and gentlemen, one of our best speakers, not just in India, but all over the world. A man who could have a conversation in an airport lounge and 40 people will join him, or rather listen to him. The one and only, the magnetic, and he's asked me to say this, the greatest Indian of all time, Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
The greatest MC of all time is right here. But I didn't ask him to say what he said.
Dr. Ji, that could mean anything, huh? Just be very careful. Just one quick word. What you don't know about Dr. Shashi Tharoor before he takes over is that he spends 3 months a year helping a third world country learn the language of English. And I mean Britain. He goes there and he teaches them every year. So big hand! Spreading the love. And we will ask him questions, but first, this is going to be fun, ladies and gentlemen. The one and only, one of the great orators of our time, Dr. Shashi Tharoor.
I don't know about great orator, but I can tell you you're a great audience. What energy! Give yourselves a hand, yeah. It's wonderful to be here at I.I.M.U.N's Championship Conference. And I must say, you folks are the global citizens of tomorrow. You will one day resolve all the big problems of the world, and that's why we are so excited to be talking to you. I think it's interesting that I.I.M.U.N has a vision statement, and that says that all of you are trying to wield the idea of India as a lodestar towards guiding the whole world, humanity, towards a different path. And I must say, having seen you folks yesterday and today and in previous years, observing and participating in some truly enriching discussions, all of which I think has testified to your boundless caliber and leadership potential, I think that there's no question in my mind that tomorrow is in safe hands, yours. And that's why I thought I will talk to you about leadership. I think Admiral Tripathi will also be talking about leadership. Others will give you their perspective. Mr. Bajaj did. Mine is very much from my experience internationally, 29 years at the UN and some time spent here too, looking at the world from within India. And I can tell you that, as you already saw in some of the discussions at the inaugural session yesterday, it's very clear the world is standing at a crossroads. There were certain things we took for granted in the first decade of the century. Globalization, the triumph of liberal democratic constitutionalism that seem today to be suddenly less triumphant. I mentioned globalization in our discussion with the former heads of state about the global village and whether that's suddenly got all these walls coming up inside it. I do believe that liberal democracy is also under threat from governments that are increasingly autocratic in their style, even those that are sometimes democratic in their appearance. Mahatma Gandhi had told us that the big yardstick of governance, and therefore of any leadership you will exercise, is whether the actions you take will wipe the tear from the eye of the poorest girl you can think of. The truth is, I'm not sure that's true anymore, even for us here in India. Today, the greatest tragedy seems to be that we have become used to human suffering. We've grown indifferent to it. So long as the clouds of gloom don't cast their shadows upon us, we remain unbothered, impervious to the fates of those whose lives, as a result of either man-made catastrophes or natural ones, have been upended, perhaps irreversibly. Just a week ago, I was in Wayanad, meeting the survivors of the terrible landslide and the destruction of villages there. These days we are reading of a different kind of horror, the rape and murder of a young doctor. After a 26-hour hard day of work, she goes to rest in an empty room where she's attacked and killed. How can we talk about ourselves and our future without confronting all the horrors that beset our fellow citizens daily? And yet it's also true that our societies are being fractured in more fundamental ways, with questions of identity and ideology dividing us and driving us farther away from each other. We need all the more leadership that can empower us and not weaken us, that can unite us and not divide us, that can help bring out our potential, not suppress us. And that's the kind of leadership I would like you all to think about in our country and in the world. That's the kind of leader you can be. We're living in a world where borders are becoming more rigid, where vulnerable communities are facing ever greater marginalization, where us versus them seems to be attaining importance in one country after another. And that's why I believe that leadership has to be global in every sense of the word. If we take those forces of globalization that I said are in danger of being reversed when I spoke to you yesterday, at the same time, we're not going to ground the jet planes, shut down the satellites, call back or cut the communications links, stop moving money. All of those things are still going to happen. And with the information technology revolution, dizzyingly accelerated now by generative artificial intelligence, we are seeing more and more at our breakfast tables, in our living rooms, on the playgrounds, on our mobile phones, glimpses of events from every corner of the globe. These are the forces of convergence, which are indeed still, we can say, capable of making the world that global village we decried yesterday. One village, one market, one audience. But alongside and facing these forces of convergence, there are also forces of divergence, of disruption, of terrorism, of the great damage being done by climate change, by the cultural and economic backlash against the liberal world order and against globalization, by civil strife in so many countries, by refugees fleeing in little boats and trying to find new lives elsewhere because they can't make it where they are. We're looking at a world in which there are various kinds of reactions to this, but many of the reactions are defensive and self-protective. Till very recently, Mr. Trump was leading in the polls, wanting to recreate Fortress America. Britain left the European Union because they didn't like the sound of the foreign languages they were hearing on their streets. The world's indifference to the suffering of the Palestinian people who are being bombarded and killed. 40,000 have lost their lives. That grim milestone was crossed quite recently. Ukraine, where people are still suffering. And God knows where else we may see more grisly headlines. There's talk of Iran perhaps reaching out to retaliate against the assassination of a Hamas leader in their capital city. So these are all the forces of divergence that are dividing us and pulling us apart at the same time that we have those forces of convergence I talked about. So we clearly can't afford to ignore the rest of the planet in anything we do. And at the same time, we have to face these contradictions. And you, as tomorrow's leaders, have to be capable of living in a world of contradictions. Let's not forget the famous 9/11. It happened before many of the young people in this room were born. But that's the incident that showed us both the promise and the dangers of the global village. Because it showed that a fire that started in a remote, dusty cave in one corner of the global village in Afghanistan could melt the steel girders holding up the tallest skyscrapers at the other end of our global village in New York. So just as convergence brings us together, even disruption, terrorism, and divergence can stretch across the globe. So even countries that once felt isolated, insulated from external dangers, maybe because of their distance, maybe because of their wealth, their strength, they now fully realize that the safety of people everywhere depends not only on local security forces, but also on guarding against terrorism, against the global spread of pollution, of disease, of illegal drugs, of weapons of mass destruction, of protecting and shielding the world against climate change and its consequences, promoting human rights, democracy, development. We all know that jobs everywhere depend not only on local firms and factories, but on faraway markets to purchase the goods, on faraway producers to send us goods and services, licenses and access from foreign governments, the free movement of goods and persons. As it was pointed out yesterday, goods can still move, persons are being restricted more and more. We need, therefore, an international system that works best. Because the truth about the world is we are all interconnected. As someone said about water pollution, we all live downstream. When the river is polluted, everyone downstream of that river has to drink the polluted water, and that's why we cannot afford to be indifferent to horrors taking place in some other corner of the planet. It affects us here too. We cannot afford to be indifferent about our neighbors, however distant they may appear, because everyone in the world is our neighbor today. Ignorance is not a shield. It is not even an excuse. So what do we do? What can I tell you all that you should think about as you aim and aspire to leadership, if you do? There is no question in my mind that leadership in a country like ours has to be anchored, first of all, in empathy. Where there's discontent and suffering, whether in the public as far as the political leader is concerned, in the office as far as those of you in corporate life will be concerned, it's our responsibility to understand what provokes it, to find long-term answers that benefit the maximum number of people. That's why I talked about empathy. And at the public policy level, at the level of a politician, I believe we have to move beyond narrow concerns of national security, which you can define as freedom from terror and attack, to a broader vision of human security, which also includes freedom from hunger and hopelessness. We need a world where everyone has food, clothing, and shelter that they can take for granted, where democracy reigns, where everyone has a say in their own future, where people's creative and entrepreneurial energies are free to assume the shapes they desire, and where the environment is protected. And that's why future leaders like you, the young people of today, must partner with other leaders in parliament and civil society, in education, and more. And we must all get involved in addressing this. As Mahatma Gandhi wisely said, you must be the change you wish to see in the world. So if you want the world to be different, be part of it. This afternoon, in talking to the principals, various school and college principals who'd gathered, I told them that Dr. Ambedkar, who's been mentioned a couple of times already, Dr. Ambedkar insisted upon introducing into the Constitution the idea of fraternity. What is fraternity? Brotherhood, literally, our sisterhood too. It is about all of us seeing each other as members of the same human family, caring for each other, and at the same time not feeling either superior or inferior to the next person, but embracing them as part of the same collectivity. That is essential. It comes with that is respect for each other, and that also means acceptance of difference. Acceptance of difference is key. In my book, Why I'm a Hindu, I talked about Swami Vivekananda telling us very proudly that the Hinduism that he preached taught not just tolerance but acceptance. It was just one sentence, but I read it as a teenager and it stayed in my mind and I kept thinking about it over and over again. And it's actually a very profound idea. Many of you would take history classes and you're told that a tolerant king is a good king because he allows people in his kingdom to do things and believe things that are different from his. But if you think about it a little more, tolerance is actually a very patronizing idea, as Swami Vivekananda understood. Because the tolerant king is really saying, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will allow you the right to be wrong. That isn't good enough, says Swami Vivekananda. What you want is acceptance. And what does acceptance teach you? Acceptance says, I believe I have the truth. You believe you have the truth. I will respect your truth. Please respect my truth. And that is the best basis to get along with each other in a society like ours, where there are so many religions, so many languages, so many ethnicities, so many people, and the same applies to the rest of the world. And therefore we must, both in our country and globally, welcome and embrace diversity. Different perspectives are embedded in our ethos here in India, and there's there in everyday life. But let me explain that very often we can all approach the same situation from different sets of assumptions. Since I've been after zero gravity, you got so much gravity from me so far, let me lighten the mood a little bit by telling you one of my favorite stories from my teenage years about the American farmer who comes to India to advise on agriculture. And he goes to this tiny farm in the Punjab, and the farm is, God knows, a dozen acres or less. And the American looks to the farmer who says very proudly, my land goes all the way up to there. The American looks and he sees a dirt road. And the American, see that highway? My land goes up to there. And it's just a dirt road. And then says, see that irrigation canal? And the American looks, he sees a trickle of water. And he says, my land goes up to there. And my land is all this. And you can see it from both sides of the corners of your eye. The American isn't terribly impressed. And then the farmer says to him, what about you? The American comes from some prairie Midwestern state where the wheat fields roll on for miles on end. So he says, well, in the morning I get into my tractor and I drive 3 hours to the northern boundary of my land. He says, and then I get into my tractor again, I drive another 4 hours to the western boundary of my land. I break for a sandwich. Then it's 2.5 hours down to the southern boundary of my land. And finally I get back into the tractor at the end of a long day, and it takes me 4 hours to get back to the ranch house. And he finds the Indian farmer nodding very sympathetically. Yes, yes, says the Indian. I too used to have a tractor like that. Get it? The joke is, he was talking about a huge farm, but it really takes that long in a tractor, because the Indian couldn't imagine a farm ever being that big. He assumed the tractor was what was giving him trouble. So what you understand depends on what your assumptions are. And that's something you must understand. The same set of facts, two different people can understand different things, and we must therefore respect other people's perspectives, look beyond the obvious and beneath the surface, and bear in mind that there's always more than one side to a story and more than one answer to a question. But this also means that our leaders will need to get comfortable in operating within these innumerable paradoxes of our society and the rest of the world. There used to be a joke about our country that anything you say about India, the opposite is also true. We like to think of ourselves as an ancient civilization, but we're also a young republic. Our IT experts and entrepreneurs are blazing boldly through the 21st century. Got a question about unicorns a few minutes ago, but many of our population still seem to live in each of the other 20 centuries. And then sometimes you find the opposites existing quite cheerfully. One of my favorite photographs from one of the Kumbh Melas, not the last one, the one before, so it's not a new story, is a photograph of a Hindu holy man, a sadhu, naked sadhu, complete out of, central casting. He has his wispy beard, warts on his face, broken teeth. He has a Rudraksha mala on his bare, ash-smeared chest. And you'll think this is your typical image of a Hindu holy man that you're going to send around the world. And he's staring away into the distance as well. Classic, timeless otherworldliness, right? But in this photograph, this Hindu holy man looking exactly like this was chatting away on a mobile phone. And that is the paradox that you have to live with in India. I actually wanted to put that photograph on the cover. I wanted to put the photograph on the cover of my book, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, but I was told by my publishers it was too much of a cliche. And yet, I think it's a very revealing cliche because it actually tells you you're living in a world where you both have the holy man and the fact that he can comfortably use a mobile phone, and you have to learn to embrace both the possibilities and the complications that that paradox represents. He doesn't need leaders in the old-fashioned sense. He needs leaders who can think out of the box, who can live with these paradoxes and rise above them. Now, some of you will also understand that in a democracy, leaders must also be responsive to the people. Sometimes a good leader also has to be a good follower. Of course, you can go too far. There's a famous story of a 19th century French politician during the the revolution in France in 1848. His name was Alexandre Auguste Ledru-Rollin, and he was actually attending a meeting in the Interior Ministry, the kind of home ministry of the day, when it was a tumultuous time, lots of action going on. He looked out of his window and he saw a mob rushing past on the street. So he promptly ran to the door saying, "I am their chief, I must follow them. Je suis leur chef, il fallait bien les suivre." And that's not leadership, you can imagine, because now it's the only thing for which Mr. Ledru-Rollin is remembered. It's not the most effective kind of leadership, because even though a leader is expected to lead some of the time and to listen some of the time, following the mob is not a good mark. Guiding the mob in the right direction and making them less of a mob would have been a greater hallmark for a leader. You have to be a good leader who can follow. Jawaharlal Nehru and Vallabhbhai Patel were Mahatma Gandhi's followers. But you need to understand yourself first before you can aspire to lead. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Be anchored in those strengths, know them, and don't let yourself down. You'll get a great, great deal achieved. And I think it's very, very important to try and see that there can be various different kinds of leadership. There's not just one model to follow. Are there cricket fans in this audience? No cricket fans? Yeah? Okay. So who can forget last year's World Cup? I don't mean this year's, I mean last year's, when after blazing a triumphant trail to the final without even losing a single match, India lost the final in the World Cup on our own soil, the ODI World Cup, right? To Australia, a team we had already trounced in the earlier rounds of the tournament. Our cricket-crazy nation lapsed into desolation. Detractors left no stone unturned in writing our team off. Captain Rohit Sharma got so much abuse. And yet, less than 9 months later, we roared back to life on the global cricketing stage with much the same team. Securing in Barbados a resounding victory in the T20 World Cup. Now, this transformation from despair to triumph, I mean, it's almost a cinema plot there for all the Bollywood people in this audience, right there. But you remember Mr. Bajaj talking about resilience. Well, there's resilience for you. You have Rohit Sharma down in the dumps, attacked, discredited, criticized. People wouldn't even have minded if he'd been dropped for the T20 World Cup. But he said he'd come back and fight. Unwavering determination, unflappable fighting spirit. And what happened? He led his boys in blue to an illustrious height, having implemented a heroic shift in mindset and strategy. And this proved once again that resilience and self-belief can turn the tide in the most arduous of circumstances. That is one form of leadership. It's essential. Tap into and energize the best of already what you possess. Know you can do better than your last attempt and try again. And then, as you know, he retired after that. He'd proved his point. So there's various kinds of leadership. There's a good captain who leads by example. I mentioned Rohit Sharma this time, but look at Mr. Ganguly, Saurav Ganguly, who instilled grit and fight into the team that was in a state of flux, leading from the front, displaying to the world his core ideas, beliefs, and value systems, taking off his T-shirt at a moment of triumph in the hallowed precincts of Lords. And then you had immediately after him, he was succeeded by Rahul Dravid, who was quiet, calm, didn't ever show any power or even emotion, but from the background instilled grit and fright into a team that was really in need of it. And then you've got Virat Kohli coming after that. Oh, in between there was Dhoni. Dhoni, captain, cool, always unflappable, always pulling the rabbit out of the hat at the last minute, right? And then after Captain Cool, you get Captain Hot, because Virat Kohli comes in blazing, eyes blazing, wearing his heart on his sleeve, intensity on the field. Now, I mentioned these four examples because many of you are familiar with them as cricket fans. And here you have somebody like Rahul Dravid, quiet and understated, someone like Dhoni, always cool and unflappable, someone like Virat Kohli, always switched on, always present, mental, physically, all the time, charging all over the place as captain. Now, it doesn't mean that's the only way you can lead. It means that each of them found his style and applied it to lead with. Sharma isn't Kohli. And you've got the much more cooler style, the calmer style, the more unflappable style. But all four of them, in their own different ways, succeeded remarkably well. There's no need to compare them, no need to look at results, no need to look. Your style will depend on how you choose to lead, what you are as an individual, and what you will find yourself coping with in the circumstances you find yourself in. It's entirely possible that you might be a great captain with a lousy team. Or you might be a lousy captain with a great team and ruin it too. There are examples of both in every field, from business to politics. And then the final thought, there may also be some of you who don't want to be a leader. Maybe you're just very happy being part of a team and letting somebody else lead. You know, in 2009, there was a famous survey conducted in America by the Girl Scouts of America. It was the largest ever survey conducted in that country of young people in America and what they thought about leadership. About 4,000 children up to age 17 were interviewed on what do you think leadership is all about? What does it mean to you? Now, there was good news and bad news. The good news is that 4/5 of those surveyed of both sexes said that women and men are equally qualified to lead. Leading isn't just for men, which is interesting because now you've got a chance for a woman for the first time to be a president in the US. But the bad news was that an actual majority had little or no interest in attaining leadership roles. What they said was, what would you like to be when you become an adult? And they gave a number of options. Many of them chose fitting in, or making a lot of money, helping animals, fighting for the environment, but didn't tick the box saying being a leader. And there's nothing wrong with that. Not everybody wants to thrust themselves in front. Not everybody can be a Rishabh Shah. But if you watch him, you feel I can do that too, do it. But there is something you should be aware of. The one problem some leaders often don't understand is they think their priorities should be everybody's priorities. They might be in a position where they can deliver on that. If you're the naval chief, I'm sure that your priorities have to be the Navy's priorities. Nobody has a choice in the matter. But there are very many environments, politics being one of them, where leaders have to be sensitive to the priorities of others too, and also have to be sensitive to the rights of others who are being led. Very often the most useful word for a leader is not me, I, myself. It is we, us. I've often said that one of the best slogans that my party ever had was a slogan that didn't work, by the way. We lost badly in the election where we tried that slogan, the election of 2014, but the slogan was very simple. It was our leader, Rahul Gandhi, surrounded by large numbers of people of different walks of life, and the slogan said, "Main nahi, hum." That's what India could be all about. And I say this to you because 2,600 years ago, in the 6th century BC, the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu wrote a poem that resonates with me even today. He was writing about kings and rulers, but think of it about leaders and politicians, presidents, you'll get what I mean. Here is the poem, 6th century BC, Lao Tzu. Quote, "Of the best rulers, the people only know that they exist. The next best, they love and praise. The next, they fear. And the next, they revile." So these are the 4 categories of leadership. But of the very best, when their task is accomplished, their work is done, the people all remark, "We have done it ourselves." Can you imagine this? That's called cooperative leadership. That's called the most successful leader. The most successful king in Lao Tzu's mind is one who knows that the objective matters more than getting credit for it, that if you can fulfill the objective and you can let everybody else feel they did it, you've achieved a greater triumph than if you achieve it and say, "I did it and you all should applaud me." The most effective results in any team are those in which the beneficiaries take ownership. They feel empowered. They don't feel you've done them a favor. They feel you've led them along to their own triumph. That brings me back full circle to where we began. I believe that as potential leaders of tomorrow in India, you have a responsibility to think about all those who are not as fortunate as you are, amongst your own fellow students in your high schools and colleges who are fortunate enough to participate in an I.I.M.U.N, but also those around the world. I've had the rare privilege as a young man of working for those who've lost everything, the world's refugees, who've lost their home, lost their loved ones, their possessions, their familiar assumptions. When I was younger, even than many of today's young leaders here, I found myself running the UN's boat program, a rescue at sea program for the Vietnamese boat people who used to be rescued by merchant vessels in the South China Sea and brought into the port of Singapore. And I'll never forget one family. They'd left Vietnam, fleeing communist rule, in a tiny boat with a cannibalized tractor engine. And sure enough, the tractor engine conked out on the high seas, and they were drifting aimlessly. But they ran out of food that they'd brought. They ran out of drinking water that they'd brought, and the family had to subsist on just rainwater and hope. The parents could somehow manage, but they had a toddler and a baby with them, an infant. These parents stumbled across the one way they could keep their children alive. They slit their own fingers and made the infant suck their blood to get some nourishment to stay alive. And when they were rescued, as it happens, by an American ship sailing by, they were so weak they couldn't even get up out of the boat. They had to be bodily lifted. The ship was brought into the port of Singapore, and my staff and I broke every rule in the book to rush them into intensive care. And then a few months later, to see the same family, healthy, well-fed, well-dressed, and setting off for new lives in the US. That gave me hope. And whenever people used to ask me in the UN days, but don't you despair that all that you're doing, there's still so much tragedy and suffering everywhere, my answer to you as leaders is, you can't do everything, but you can always do something. You cannot solve every problem in the world and every headline in the world, but you can solve one or two problems, see the results, and as a result, you can feel that hope and that determination to keep on trying. I just want you all to think that for me, the greatest satisfaction in my UN career was knowing that I could put my head to the pillow at night, aware that things I had done during the day, whatever they were, and each day was different, had made a difference to real human beings' lives. To human beings who were real people, who suffered, who had lost, who wanted hope and a future. And that is a privilege every one of you can take on. It can be very simple things in your home. You can teach your domestic servant's child to read. You can perhaps give the child something that he and his parents could not afford. You can go out into the street and make somebody smile through a gesture of kindness. It doesn't have to be that you're solving a problem from the world's headlines. But that sense of responsibility for other human beings' welfare marks a true leader, and that's something every one of us can have, whatever we do in life. Whether we're in business, whether we're in an office, whether we're in public life, whether we're in the army or the navy or the air force, it doesn't matter. Every one of us can make a difference for other people, and that ultimately is my message to you. I'll end with an old Puranic story that I was rather fond of. It's an old story about truth. A story about 2,000 years old, by the way. It seems that in ancient times, a brash young warrior sought the hand of a beautiful princess. The king, her father, thought the warrior was a bit too cocksure and callow. So he told him he could only marry the princess once he had found truth. So the young warrior set off on a quest for truth. He went to temples and monasteries, to mountaintops where sages meditated, and to forests where ascetics scourged themselves. But nowhere could he find truth. Despairing one day and seeking refuge from a thunderstorm, he found himself in a dank and musty cave. There in the darkness was an old hag with warts on her face and matted hair, her skin hanging in folds from her bony limbs, her teeth broken, her breath malodorous. But she greeted him. She seemed to know what he was looking for. They talked all night, and with each word she spoke, the warrior realized he had come to the end of his quest. She, this old woman, she was truth. In the morning when the storm broke, the warrior prepared to return to claim his bride. Now that I have found truth, he said as he parted from the old crone, what shall I tell them at the palace about you? But the wizened old hag smiled. Tell them, she said, tell them that I'm young and beautiful. So truth, the Puranas are teaching us, is not always true. But that does not mean truth does not exist. Even our country's national motto, Satyameva Jayate, truth alone triumphs, can be understood in countless ways. One could say we are at least home to 1.45 billion truths. Each one of us might have our own truths, and that's why I say to each one of you young people, find your own truth and strive to live up to it. That may be the simplest prescription for your leadership. Thank you very much for listening to me. Jai Hind.